I used to love Christmas. The smell of pine and cinnamon, the way snow muffles everything outside and makes your whole house feel like the only warm place on earth. My husband Marcus and I had this tradition. We alternated holidays. One Christmas with his family, one with mine. It was simple. It worked. For 6 years, it worked perfectly. That Christmas, the one I'm about to tell you about, was supposed to be with his family, his mother, Renee, his aunt and a handful of cousins, and my father, Carl, who Marcus and I had invited as a special addition because he'd had a rough year after my mother passed. We thought bringing the families together would be good for everyone. I genuinely believed that. I was so naive. Let me paint you a picture of Renee because you need to understand who she is before you understand what happened. Renee is the kind of woman who fills every room she enters. 62 years old, still sharp-eyed, still wearing heels to family dinners. She was widowed 12 years before the story begins, and she wore that widowhood like an accessory, something elegant she knew how to carry. She had this particular smile, the kind that made you feel like you were always slightly behind on a joke she was telling at your expense. My father, Carl, was 64, quiet, a retired civil engineer who collected old maps and made his own pasta from scratch. He and Renee had met briefly at our wedding 5 years earlier, a quick handshake, a polite smile, the kind of non-encounter that leaves zero impression on anyone. Or so I thought. The holiday started beautifully. Marcus and I arrived first, hauling bags and a bottle of wine and a casserole dish wrapped in foil. Renee's house was exactly as it always was, spotless, decorated with tasteful silver ornaments, a fire crackling behind a glass screen in the living room. The kind of home that looks like it was styled for a magazine shoot. My father arrived about 40 minutes later. He knocked on the door rather than ringing the bell, which was so classically him, that small, old-fashioned gesture. I hugged him in the doorway. He smelled like his familiar aftershave, something woody and clean. He looked better than I expected, some color in his face, calmer than he'd seemed at Thanksgiving. I brought him into the living room to greet everyone and watched him cross to Renee with his hand extended. She stood up. And that's when I noticed something that I immediately filed away as nothing. She stood up before he even reached her. Not because she was being polite. She stood up the way you stand when someone you know walks into a restaurant, that quick, involuntary rise. And there was something in her face, just for a fraction of a second, that smoothed out, like a small tension she'd been holding suddenly released. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I turned to get my father a drink. Dinner was loud, warm, and wine-soaked in the best possible way. Marcus's cousins argued cheerfully about football. The food was good. My father sat across the table from Renee, and they talked. About nothing unusual, just the kind of polite conversation you make with the mother of your child's spouse. Except they talked for a long time. And at one point I looked over and they were both leaning slightly forward, voices low, and Renee laughed, genuinely laughed at something my father said. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that catches you off guard and makes you press your chest to your hand. I nudged Marcus. When did those two become friends? He glanced, shrugged. Mom's just being friendly. She does that. I nodded. I picked up my fork. I let it go. After dinner, while Marcus and his cousins moved to the living room, I went to the kitchen to help with the dishes. His Aunt Sandra was already at the sink, and I joined her, falling into that easy domestic rhythm of passing plates and rinsing glasses. Sandra is the kind of person who says everything with her eyes before she ever opens her mouth. She handed me a wet bowl to dry and looked at me sideways. Did you know your dad and Renee have been talking? My hands slowed. Talking? Like tonight? I mean, before tonight. She said it quietly, measured, like she was handing me something fragile and watching to see if I'd drop it. The towel in my hands had gone completely still. How long? I asked. Sandra set down the pan she was holding. I genuinely don't know, Diane. I saw it. I thought you should know. Now, I want to be clear about something. In the moment Sandra told me that, my first reaction was not rage. It wasn't disgust. It was this strange underwater feeling, the sensation of your brain trying to process something that just won't compute, like trying to open a file your system doesn't recognize. My father and Renee texting? I put the bowl down carefully on the counter, said something vague about needing some air, and walked to the back of the house. I stood in Renee's hallway for a moment, just breathing. The laughter from the living room drifted toward me. Easy, uncomplicated laughter from people who didn't know what I now knew. Or thought I knew. I still didn't know anything for certain. That's when I heard my father's voice, low, coming from around the corner near the study. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I genuinely wasn't. I just stepped forward, and his voice became words. I can't keep doing this, Renee. One of them is going to figure it out. A pause. Then Renee's voice, quieter, just a little longer, after the holidays. The floor felt like it shifted under me. I didn't storm around the corner. I didn't scream. I walked very carefully back to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood over the sink drinking it one slow sip at a time. My mind was running the math with a cold, clinical precision I didn't know I possessed. How long had this been going on? What exactly was this? They were both adults, both widowed, or in my father's case, newly grieving. Were they dating? Had they been dating while my mother was alive? That thought arrived like a door slamming shut somewhere deep in my chest. I needed to know the timeline. I needed to know everything. And I was not going to ruin Christmas dinner for the entire extended family over a sentence I'd heard in a hallway. So I went back to the living room. I sat down. I smiled. And I kept watching. The tell, when it finally came, was so small that I almost missed it. We had moved to dessert, Renee's famous almond cake, and everyone was talking. My father said something about a restaurant he'd recently visited, and without thinking, Renee said, "Oh, I loved that place." Then she caught herself, added quickly, "I've heard it's wonderful." But Marcus's cousin, Tyler, who is 24 and has the social awareness of a golden retriever, said brightly, "Wait, have you been? Mom said you went somewhere nice for your birthday." The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. 2 seconds is a very long time. Renee said smoothly that Tyler must be thinking of somewhere else. My father looked down at his cake. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked confused. And underneath the table, I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed. That night, after the cousins left and Marcus fell asleep, I sat in the guest room with my phone and started to do what any reasonable person does when their world quietly implodes. I looked for evidence. I found my father's shared photo album, the one he'd set up on his phone after my mother died so family members could add photos. He rarely used it himself. But I scrolled back and back and back, and there it was, 6 months before that Christmas. A photo my father had uploaded and then, I think, forgotten about. A restaurant table, 2 glasses of wine, out of focus in the background, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a very particular set of pearl earrings I recognized immediately, because I had seen those exact earrings on Renee's ears no less than 10 times. He'd been seeing her for at least 6 months. 6 months after my mother's funeral. I'm not going to pretend I handled the next few days with grace. I didn't. I called my father the morning after Christmas, and the conversation it was brutal. Not because I yelled. I didn't yell. I spoke in that very flat, very quiet voice that is somehow worse than yelling. And I asked him directly. He went silent for a very long time. And then he said, "Diane, I was going to tell you." I asked him when my mother's death had become the starting gun for whatever this was. He said it wasn't like that he and Renee had reconnected at our wedding 5 years earlier, that they'd kept in very occasional contact for years, that it had only become something more after my mother passed. I understood every word he said. I understood it intellectually, and I still couldn't breathe. The conversation with Marcus was a different kind of hard. He sat very still while I told him. He has this thing he does when he's processing something difficult. He goes almost completely motionless, like a held breath. He sat like that for a long time. Then he said quietly, "My mom knew I'd react badly. That's why she hid it." "Yes," I said. He looked at the ceiling. "So now what? What does this make us? If they ever—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to, because that was the part neither of us had fully articulated yet. If our parents formalized their relationship, if they married, my husband and I would technically become step-siblings. By law, by family structure. Every holiday, every dinner, every family gathering would fold two families into one in the most disorienting, structurally bizarre way imaginable. It sounds almost like something out of a soap opera. I know it does. I lived it, and I still can barely believe it. We confronted Renee together. Marcus and I sat across from her in that same perfectly decorated living room, and I watched her composure, that legendary, uncrackable composure, develop its first real fracture. She said she knew it looked bad. She said she hadn't meant for it to go this far this quickly. She said Carl, my father, made her feel less alone for the first time in 12 years, and she was sorry, genuinely sorry, that they'd handled it with secrecy instead of honesty. Marcus asked her the question I hadn't been able to form. "Were you ever going to tell us?" She said yes, after the holidays, when they felt more stable about what it was. "You let us invite him to Christmas dinner, knowing all of this. And you sat there." She had no answer for that. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing I heard all season. It has been over a year since that Christmas. My father and Renee are still together. They don't hide it anymore. They exist in this strange, acknowledged space at the edge of our lives, present but layered with a complication that never fully dissolves. Marcus and I have talked about it so many times that we've worn grooves into the conversation. We've landed somewhere between acceptance and a permanent low-grade unease that I suspect is just the shape of our family now. We don't alternate holidays anymore. We stopped that tradition the Christmas everything shattered, and quietly never resumed it. I still love Christmas, I think. But that smell of pine and cinnamon, the one I told you about at the very beginning, sometimes it hits me and I feel two things at the exact same moment: warmth and the cold echo of two voices in a hallway deciding that a little longer after the holidays would be enough. It wasn't. It never is.